Hello class, welcome to The Real Plato. So what we're going to try to do in this video is cover the first 7 books of Plato's Republic. Last week we covered the transition from Socrates to Plato, focusing on some of Plato's more poetic dialogues, and also his views on religion. Let no one destitute of geometry enter these doors. Just kidding. This is one of the most assigned texts in colleges in the world. Some of you may have already read it or bits of it. And since most of you are philosophy majors, you will have definitely read at least The Myth of the Cave. That's where we'll wind up today at the beginning of Book 7. What we're going to try to do is a more systematic reading of all the interesting moments in the Republic leading up to The Myth of the Cave. So if you manage to get through this whole video, you'll have a basic knowledge of the Republic. Let's begin by reviewing the transition from Socrates to Plato, this time according to Karatani. Karatani first notes the common view that we most witness this transition from the early to the middle Plato in the Phaedo and the Credo, and underlines how the expressed views of Socrates on death in the Apology are more agnostic than the preaching about the immortal soul and the afterlife that we find in the Phaedo and that's rooted in Plato's theory of the forms. Whenever we see Plato talking about participation in the forms, Greek methexis, it does not seem to be the historical Socrates speaking, but rather the influence of the Pythagorean theory of number on Plato. Pythagoreans had spoken of the imitation, mimesis of number, and Plato adopts this, but instead uses the word participation or methexis. So whenever we see Plato talking forms or eidos or ideas, sensible things, and of the realms of ideas or forms as separate from this physical reality, we can be fairly sure that these ideas, when expressed through the mouthpiece of Socrates, were not Socrates's. It is significant that the key for understanding how the sensible and the intellectual are divided is first articulated in the scene of the death of Socrates. It is at this point that he utilizes Socrates to enact a drama of liberation of the ideal object. And in this way, the death of Socrates becomes the indispensable axis of Plato's philosophical system. His middle and later writings, such as the Republic, the Theaetetus, the Sophist, the Parmenides, Timaeus, and many others, Plato continues to bring this character of Socrates on stage. This does not mean that everything put in the mouth of the character Socrates in the middle and later Plato is definitely just Plato's own ideas. Very often he stages a transition, the types of opinions and discourse that the historical Socrates may have actually had, to his own new solutions. And all these later depictions of Socrates, in fact, continually evoke the death of Socrates. We'll see this several times at key points in the Republic. To Karatani, Plato's own key philosophical struggle was his opposition to Ionian natural philosophy. And in his later writings, he does not conceal this intent. For example, in the Sophist, he uses the analogy of a war raging between the Titans and the gods as an analogy for the struggle of his formalism versus Ionian materialism. What Plato was trying to accomplish was not naive restoration of personalized gods, but rather the securing of a teleological worldview. The origination and destination of all being in this world is the beyond, from which this world emerges and to which it returns, in relation to which it can only be ever at best our participation in true reality, this world becoming the shadowy image of a deeper and higher reality. Like other scholars, Karatani approaches the Republic in terms of the theme of ascents within it. There are in fact 5 ascents that structure the literary and philosophical content of the Republic. First, an ascent from Piraeus, the port town, to Athens at the beginning in Book 1. Also a mystical ascent from the underworld or Hades into the daylight. Before long, an epistemological ascent up the 4 segments of the divided line. And then in the Myth of the Cave, an allegorical ascent from the depths of the earth towards the light of the sun. And at the very end of the Republic, in the Myth of Air, a mythical ascent from earthly embodiment into that heavenly place where bodies themselves get chosen and decided. Geographically, the first ascent is framed as a return from Piraeus, the port, to the town of Athens. Piraeus was a much rougher place. Going down there for a festival would have been a bit like slumming it for the Athenians. The dialogue begins with Socrates saying, "I went down to Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, the son of Ariston." This is Plato's brother, to say a prayer to the goddess, and I also wanted to see how they would manage the festival, since they were holding it for the first time. It's on his way back from Piraeus that Socrates meets Polemarchus and Adeimantus, Adeimantus being another of Plato's brothers. They're still in Piraeus when the dialogue begins and are planning on attending the torch race on horseback for the goddess and the all-night festival. Apparently, this is the first time the Athenians had held festivities for the goddess Bendis, a form of Artemis. From what we know about this festival, it was quite Dionysiac. The Bendidaia also featured a solemn joint procession of the Athenians and the Thracians to the goddess's sanctuary, but before returning for the all-night festivities, they go at Polemarchus' prompting to the house of the aged Cephalus, where quite a crowd is gathered in discussion. I think the assumption is they never made it back for the night-long festival, becoming so enwrapped in a long discourse. When they find the distinguished old Cephalus, he appears very old but also sacred, with a wreath on his head, and they first discuss the burdens of old age and how to bear them. This leads to a discussion of whether it is better to be just or unjust and what justice is. The overall structure of the Republic is a bit like this. Book 1, the conversation with Cephalus, and then with Thrasymachus and others on the nature of justice. This is known as the Elenchus. And then the main argument of the book begins in earnest in books 2, 3, and 4. These seem to reflect some Platonic developments from what Socrates taught. At this point, the dialogue enters into its most philosophical phase with a series of digressions, books 5, 6, and 7, which seem to be definitely Platonic with very little elements of anything that Socrates actually taught. After the digressions are complete, we return to the main argument and get its conclusion and summation in books 8, 9, and then 10. We're going to try to get all the way through the Elenchus, the main arguments, as well as the main digressions today, so strap in, it's going to be a wild ride. The main topic of the book as a whole is the nature of justice, or in Greek, dikaiosune. The Elenchus provides a dialogue on conventional definitions of justice, which end up being unsatisfactory. Thus, the main argument begins in Book 2 with a new attempt to define justice, to show that justice is better than injustice, by way of articulating utopia, or ideal city-state, the Kallipolis, as a model from which the nature of justice can be read off more precisely. The most philosophically significant parts of the books are actually the digressions, in which we find Plato presenting his epistemology, metaphysics, aesthetics, and other key arguments of Plato's philosophy. We find in Nuse 3 definitions of justice in Book 1. First, Cephalus's, justice is honesty in word and deed, or simply paying one's debts and obligations. Followed by Polemarchus, justice is helping friends and harming enemies, or giving everyone his due. And then the most profound but also controversial argument, which sets off the work as a whole as a response, by Thrasymachus, that justice is the rule of the stronger and is less profitable than injustice. Some interesting moments in Book 1. First, in the charming conversation of Socrates and Cephalus. Cephalus notes how some old people lament and long for the lost pleasures of sex, drinking parties, and feasts. The wise are very glad to have escaped all that, like a slave who has escaped from a deranged and savage master, quoting Sophocles. Within the purview of this conversation, the unjust are haunted when they are old, whereas the just have hope. And justice is first defined in terms of the poet Simonides as giving what is due or owed, as giving to each what is appropriate to them. This leads to Polemarchus' interjection and the emphasis on the friend-enemy distinction. Who is the true friend? Who is the true enemy? And situating of justice as a relation between friends, rather than between friends and enemies. At this point, Thrasymachus enters the dialogue like a wild beast about to spring. What nonsense! And everyone is dumbstruck, and Socrates even trembles a little. This image of Socrates trembling before the ferocious ebullience of Thrasymachus is quite interesting. Indeed, Thrasymachus' discourse is quite berating. That's Socrates' usual irony for you. All questions, no answers. What a sophistic quibbler he is. And Thrasymachus announces his definition of justice with arrogant certainty. I say justice is nothing other than what is advantageous for the stronger. Now praise me. Socrates finds this definition interesting and tries to interrogate it a bit, to which he gets more abuse. You disgust me, Socrates. I clearly didn't mean just the physical ruler shall prevail, but rather that what is just is what benefits the ruling structure. Socrates next points out that rulers in fact make errors, which are carried out by the weaker against their advantage. Thrasymachus, well, I guess so, but the true ruler, as ruler, is infallible. At this point, there begins a discussion of the natural aim of ruling. Is it to benefit the whole society or to benefit the rulers? Clearly, the aim of medicine is health, and the aim of sailorship, safe passage in the seas. And interestingly, at this point, all the conversants agree that practitioners of a given craft are not in competition with each other. They are rather all beholden to the aim or goal of that craft. The implication here being that true rulership is not a competition with other would-be rulers or rulers of other city-states, but ought to be guided by the aim of ruling well. More abuse from Thrasymachus. Tell me, Socrates, do you still have a wet nurse? According to Thrasymachus here, Socrates' image of the ruler guided by the ideals of rulership has obviated the difference of sheep and shepherds. The shepherds are by nature fitted to rule over the sheep. Furthermore, they are above the law in some sense, or sovereign, and thus for rulers there is value and utility in injustice. Blessed are the unjust, quoth Thrasymachus, and it is better to do injustice than to suffer it. But we can speak of injustice in local cases. On a large enough scale, injustice, that is, rulership as such, is stronger, freer, and more masterful. Next ensues some skeptical inquiries into Thrasymachus' claims, and whether his definition of justice as the rule of the stronger is coherent. For surely even an unjust ruler requires a just citizenry. And are there not wages for injustice, especially when it comes to rulers? Does injustice really cement the rule of the stronger, or does it not produce fear, bad reputation, and potential social collapse? At this point, Socrates attempts to define justice as virtue and injustice as vice. But Thrasymachus doesn't take the bait. For him, justice is a noble naivete, and injustice is not deviousness, but rather prudence. More definitional quibbles follow, as well as attempted deductions of the nature of justice, but to no avail. Thrasymachus seems to be winning the argument, but the implications are startling. For how can we associate the unjust ruler with wisdom, virtue, and goodness? The world Thrasymachus presents is a topsy-turvy one. At this point, though only temporarily, Thrasymachus feels caught. He sees the implications of Socrates' line of questioning. According to his definition of justice, all links between justice and wisdom, virtue, and goodness have been severed. And just as Socrates had earlier trembled when Thrasymachus enters the scene, now Thrasymachus blushes. But only briefly, for he soon regains his composure. This is where Socrates begins to take over the dialogue, but still unconvincingly, first framing his arguments in terms of the ethical intuition that a city becomes stronger through justice. The problem with this argument is that sometimes, if not often, injustice is necessary. However, too much injustice and everything devolves into infighting, factions, hatred, and the dissolution of social trust. Nevertheless, just people are a prerequisite for the happy and flourishing city. And if everyone was unjust, it would simply be a war of all against all. Alas, at this point, the dialogue still hasn't gotten anywhere, and Thrasymachus' ethical inversions still haunt us, and end up informing the subsequent history of political philosophy to an extreme degree, especially in Hobbes' conception of a state of nature and the need for Leviathan. Nobody in this conversation is happy with the outcome at this point, for it seems that Thrasymachus has won the argument. And Socrates, in fact, at the end of Book 1 concedes. He tried to refute Thrasymachus by reforging the link between justice and virtue, goodness, and wisdom, but this was impetuous. For this conversation isn't going to get anywhere until we talk about the nature of justice itself, what it is. This sets up the beginning of Book 2. Notice Thrasymachus has not really stormed off, but he's rather remaining in the background. We hear from him only once or twice later in the dialogue, which is the only indication that he's still in attendance. Starting with Book 2, the conversation shifts, with Glaucon and Adeimantus playing the role of midwife to Socrates' presenting of his theory of justice. Glaucon and Adeimantus begin Book 2 by playing devil's advocate and argue that justice is only instrumentally good and that the life of the unjust is better. What is worthwhile is merely the appearance of being just. The myth of the ring of Gyges here is introduced. By playing devil's advocate, what they want to argue for is that the just life is intrinsically valuable. You see, I think Thrasymachus gave up before he had to, as if he were a snake that you had charmed. We should begin by hearing what justice and injustice are, what power each has when it is just by itself in the soul, and leave out the discussion of wages and consequences. This sets up the Republic in modern terms as a deontological discussion about the nature of justice, rather than a consequentialist account. Glaucon wants Socrates to refute the idea that people only do what is just unwillingly because of the compulsion of obeying the law, and that ultimately the life of the unjust person is best so long as they can get away with it. The Myth of Gyges' ring is designed to demonstrate that people only act justly because they lack power. Let's check out a little YouTube production on Gyges' ring.
The freedom to act unjustly without fear of retribution would be most easily realized if both people had the power they say the ancestor of Gyges of Lydia possessed. The story goes that he was a shepherd in the service of the ruler of Lydia. There was a violent thunderstorm, and an earthquake broke open the ground and created a chasm at the place where he was tending his sheep. Seeing this, he was filled with amazement and went down into it. And there, in addition to many other wonders of which we are told, he saw a hollow bronze horse. There were window-like openings in it, and, peeping in, he saw a corpse which seemed to be of more than human size, wearing nothing but a gold ring on its finger. He took the ring and came out of the chasm. He wore the ring at the usual monthly meeting that reported to the king on the state of the flocks. And as he was sitting among the others, he happened to turn the setting of the ring towards himself to the inside of his hand. When he did this, he became invisible to those sitting near him, and they went on talking as if he had gone. He wondered at this, and, fingering the ring, he turned the setting outwards again and became visible. So he experimented with the ring to test whether it indeed had this power, and it did. If he turned the setting inward, he became invisible. If he turned it outward, he became visible again. When he realized this, he at once arranged to become one of the messengers sent to report to the king. And when he arrived there, he seduced the king's wife, attacked the king with her help, killed him, and took over the kingdom. This story, known as the Myth of Gyges, comes from the second book in Plato's Republic. It is introduced in a dialogue between Socrates and a character named Glaucon. Socrates and Glaucon had previously been exploring questions about the nature of justice. Socrates claimed that justice is among the highest goods, since it is valued both because of itself and because of what comes from it. Glaucon argues against this view and claims that to do justice without paying the penalty is actually better than acting justly. However, the worst situation is one in which someone suffers injustice without being able to take revenge. As such, Glaucon says that people value justice not as a good, but because they are too weak to do injustice with impunity. Therefore, justice is not both intrinsically and extrinsically valuable, as Socrates claimed. It is onerous but beneficial to us, so that we wouldn't choose it for its own sake, but for the sake of rewards and other things that come from acting justly. By way of example, Glaucon presents the Myth of Gyges. Glaucon thinks that if there were two magical rings, and we were to give one to a just person and the other to an unjust person, both people would end up acting in the same way, that is, in an unjust manner. Glaucon believes that this myth is a great proof that one is never just willingly, but only when compelled to be. Furthermore, he anticipates a possible objection by arguing that if a person were given such a ring and failed to act unjustly, we would secretly consider them to be foolish in passing up such an opportunity, though we might still publicly praise this person's actions. The Myth of Gyges is significant because it raises the question of whether justice can truly be valued in and of itself, and if it is better to act justly than it is to act unjustly. These are questions that Plato attempts to answer in the remaining 200 pages of the Republic. The Myth of Gyges also forces Socrates to defend his claim that the just person is happier than the unjust person, since Glaucon's story seems to suggest that it's actually in your own self-interest to act in an unjust manner. As such, the Myth of Gyges plays a significant role in posing some important questions in the Republic about the nature and value of justice.
Cute video, huh? Not just instrumentally valuable. Socrates replies with the analogy of justice in the soul and justice in the city, presenting two principles for the founding of the city. One, no one is self-sufficient, we need cooperation in order to thrive, so we are political animals. And two, individuals are naturally better or worse at performing some tasks. So the basic question of the first third of Book 2, is it better to be just or merely to be believed to be just? And this leads naturally to a discussion of religion, Do the gods really reward the just and punish the unjust? Or in the poet Pindar's famous formulation of the question, is it by justice or by crooked tricks that we will scale a higher wall? Notice the discussion of poetry and traditional wisdom begins here in Book 2 of the Republic in the form of looking to what the poets have said about virtue and vice, piety and impiety, and the interconnection between these things and religion. That is, in the context of a discussion about the good of religion. And various views of the afterlife are considered, such as the Orphic. It seems the greatest poets agree that injustice in the soul is a great evil, but poets and priests have not convincingly explained why and what the consequences of vice and injustice are. For Plato, this is something of a dead end. If we want to understand justice, we can't start from religious conceptions of virtue or religious eschatologies. That is, theories about the rewards for the blessed and the punishments of the damned, as these types of conceptions assume what we set out to prove. Notice this does not devalue poetic and religious conceptions of justice in the afterlife. It simply says they're not fair game to assume as premises if we are to set out from first principles what the nature of justice is. What is needed, according to Socrates, is a new method of investigation. Quote, investigation we are undertaking is not an easy one, in my view, but requires keen insight. So since we are not clever people, I think we should adopt the method of investigation that we would use if, lacking keen eyesight, we were told to identify small letters from a distance, and then noticed that the same letter existed elsewhere in larger font and on a larger surface. We would consider it a godsend, I think, to be allowed to identify the larger ones first, and then examine the smaller ones to see whether they are really the same. In modern terms, this is the first formulation in Western philosophy of the method of what Heidegger will call the hermeneutical circle. And notice that it's a tautological method. If we don't know how to define something, and we can't import premises in our definitions such as those from religion or poetry, we must begin by sharpening our senses of observation, as well as thinking by analogy. In the case of justice, we are so removed from it in our unjust societies that we can't make out its nature at a distance. We must seek for its features or attributes, its elements, in larger letters on a larger surface, in order that we can learn to recognize the signs of justice in the just city. From seeing justice at work in a macrocosm, we will be better informed to see what it is in itself and close the distance by comparison. Of course, this sets up the thought experiment of the Republic, the principled investigation into the just city. So let's begin to discuss what would be an ideally just organization of a city. For Plato here, this begins from the recognition that we are interdependent creatures. No one can do everything, so individuals should focus their energy in those areas for which they have natural abilities. From each according to their talent, or into each according to their worth. In this way, the city will best meet its needs. The first principle of division or division of labor and specialization in the city requires that we have workers for all the essential services. Farmers, builders, weavers, shoemakers, carpenters, metalworkers, herdsmen, merchants, retailers, and wage earners. These are the professions that are needed for health and flourishing at the most basic level of St. Maslow's hierarchy. The healthy city in this sense is the one that meets all its basic needs. But it is not very sophisticated or advanced in culture. Socrates describes it as a city in which the citizens will be naked in summer, clothed in winter, with plenty of cakes and leaves, yew and myrtle couches, feasting, wine, sex, wreaths, and hymning the gods. Is the primitive or indigenous life. And it sounds pretty good to me, although it is described in the dialogue as the life of pigs. Notice the influence of this depiction on subsequent Western myths of a pristine or golden age, the age of Kronos, and even of Rousseau's myth of the noble savage. Although this minimalistic healthy city receives scant attention in the Republic, it will continue to exert a fascination on the subsequent history of political philosophy. Next, Plato discusses luxurious cities, or cities that meet all the basic needs, plus some luxuries desired by the citizens. Why does Socrates agree to luxuries in the first place? Well, they cause all sorts of problems in Kallipolis and accentuate vice in the appetitive soul. Well, yes, but some luxuries are inevitable, and of course Socrates was a Greek and loves them as much as any other. We need awesome furniture and fancy desserts and relishes, that is, rich and satisfying delicacies, sort of like modern hors d'oeuvres. But immediately with the introduction of relishes, we come upon a problem. That is the feverish city, always on the hunt for new pleasures. Why is a society constituted in this way inevitable? Well, according to dialogue, there's nothing to stop us. Certainly these Greeks don't want to give up their couches, tables, and other furnitures and relishes, and of course incense and perfumes and prostitutes and pastries, and every variety or multifariousness of each, and painting and embroidery and gold and ivory and everything of that sort. And at this point we'll need hunters and artists or imitators and music, that is poets and their assistants, rhapsodes, actors, choral dancers, and theatrical producers. For what's a luxurious party without its entertainment? And we'll also need meat farms and adornment for women, and servants and tutors and wet nurses and nannies and beauticians and barbers and cooks. Well, why not, says Socrates. So we've graduated from the healthy city to the luxurious one, and things are still looking pretty good, but there's just one problem that comes up now. That is war. At a certain point, we're not exactly sure where in the dialogue the luxurious city ceases to be self-sufficient in its own borders. It amasses wealth and it trades. It needs to protect its wealth and opulence from hostile neighbors, as well as seizing the assets of neighboring populations to fuel its profligate lifestyle. And both due to its own luxuriance and to the threat of other cities, this city needs a standing army. And this is where Plato introduces the guardian class, separate from the city in every way, having a gentle and high-spirited nature like a noble dog, and even being philosophical, that is set away from all the hubbub of luxury. Why do the guardians need to be separated? If they were simply raised within the healthy come luxurious city, they'd be too absorbed in the life of pleasure and selfishness to be excellent fighters and noble protectors. Separation of the guardians already introduces the problem of their happiness, for which Aristotle will take Plato to task in the Politics. The education of the guardians proposed by Plato indeed sounds very strenuous, but it's not without its advantages. There will be two primary subjects of education for the young guardians, that is, gymnasticate for their bodies and musicate for the soul. Musicate includes music, dancing, mythology, storytelling, and gymnasticate sports, training exercises, and warrior culture. By giving the guardians this type of education, Plato hopes to make them not only nobler, but also happier than the producers who remain in the city's walls. It is in terms of the education of the guardians, specifically what types of musicate they should be taught, that Plato introduces his censorship or critique of the poets. As it stands, the stories we imbibe as children are unregulated, and yet they have a profound impact on our moral character. Children are indeed very malleable in infancy and young adulthood. And if we're going to raise the most excellent kind of human beings, we should definitely supervise the types of stories that they're told. What are our major stories? Is Game of Thrones and Harry Potter really enough to form upstanding human beings? In Plato's day, the universal inheritance of narrative myth and musicae consists of figures like Hesiod and Homer and many others. But across these founding myths, which were the basis for education at the time, we find a great many unpalatable stories, such as the severing of Uranos' testicles falling into the sea at the birth of Aphrodite, or marital discourse between Zeus and Hera and her chaining, or the lameness of the forge god Hephaestus and his subsequent cuckolding, and this list could go on for several hours. Greek myth is pretty multifarious and very often grotesque. Now, according to Plato, the young can't distinguish what's allegorical from what's not, and so the opinions they absorb from a young age, mythic images, become hard to erase and apt to become unalterable. Plato's overall critique of Greek poetry and religion is part of a more general argument that our aesthetics we take in from the senses and our ethos, or how we live, are intrinsically bound up. There is really not yet a separation between aesthetics and ethics in Plato. Rather, beauty and virtue are tied together. What Plato proposes here is a principle of critique and censorship of the arts rooted in a theological doctrine. The gods, insofar as they are gods, are all good and transparent and one in their moral command. We should thus purify Greek religion of these stories concerning double jeopardy or moral ambiguity, competing demands from different gods. He's not promoting book burning, but rather the control of history by those capable of discerning its meaning. Only a very few people pledged to secrecy and after sacrificing a pig should hear these ancestral stories, and their number should be kept quite small. The reason they should not be simply given over to general consumption is that they're enabling, and also hard to deal with and reconcile with the truth. People shouldn't grow up hearing that in committing the worst crimes, they're doing nothing out of the ordinary. And the whole setup of Greek mythology, with its continual conflicts and overthrows between fathers and sons, really sets up a bad example. How can we ensure that the first stories which children hear are the best and the most virtuous? And for Plato, the answer to this seemingly practical question is actually theological. People's ideas about God and the gods, the divinities and the divine reflect their highest values. A god must always be represented as he is. And how is that? Well, gods are all good and beneficial and in no way harmful and bad. This is Plato's deep editorial on Greek religion, an example of the type of quote we must censor from our poetic past. There are two urns at the threshold of Zeus, one filled with good fates and the other with bad ones. How could this be true if Zeus is really all good and the best of the gods? How, if Zeus is all good, are there bad fates at all under his care? Could it be that God is the origin of evil? Of course, these questions will have a long and illustrious history in Christian philosophy of religion. Many Christian theologians, in discussing the problem of evil, will return in some sense to these parts of Plato's Republic. Next, Plato proposes that we censor all art forms and rewrite all mythic narratives that lie and dissemble and promote vice and disorder in the soul. We should only allow into the ideal city and artists who enable and promote virtuous human flourishing. Keep in mind here that the Greeks appreciated spectacle as much as we do, in their terms the arts of the thespians and the pantomimes. And Plato here speaks comically of the traveling performer who will undertake to imitate thunder, the sound of wind, hail, axles, pulleys, trumpets, flutes, pipes, and other instruments, and even the cries of dogs, sheep, and birds, and his style would consist entirely of imitation in voice and gesture. This seems to be the equivalent of the Greek carnivalesque, and it sounds like a pretty good show to me. It's not the kind of spectacle that should be promoted in Kallipolis, according to Plato. A yet more dangerous form of artistry, which seems to have been somewhat popular in the Greek city-state, is sorcery, the art of the gunes. Here Plato considers all people with a manic performative disposition to be potential dangers to the health of the soul in a well-ordered state. To be sure, a poetic performer who is multifarious and imitates everything is to be revered. We should bow down before him as someone holy, amazing, pleasing, but also send him along his way with all due respect, pomp, and splendor. Fantastic, uncanny, but not in our city. Why should we ban all the really fun people in Kallipolis? Here begins the psychological dimension of the Republic, and the preference for stable over suggestible dispositions and human natures. According to Plato, the best are least liable to alternation and change, aren't they? For example, isn't the healthiest and strongest body least changed by food, drink, and labor, or the healthiest and strongest plant by sun, wind, and the like? The most courageous and most rational soul is least disturbed and altered by outside affection. And in general, whatever is in good condition, whether by nature or craft or both, admits least of being changed by anything else. This psychological preference for stability and the stalwart character as opposed to the sensitive and changeable one is then rooted again in a theological principle. What is divine is what is most stable, unchanging, eternal, and perfect. And according to this, even the Greek codes or myths of hospitality, that is, training children to think that any stranger appearing in town might well be a god in disguise. So we better be reverent to strangers, hospitable to foreigners. Even this is blasphemous. It produces superstitious children. The purpose of all this censorship for Plato is not to take our friendship with each other and with the gods too lightly. Aristotle will critique this principle as well and say that the relation of human beings to the gods is not one of friendship. In Plato, however, the good gods are in fact our friends. What exactly does Plato propose to censor in literature and the arts? Well, first of all, horror and lamentation and violent laughter and everything that strips us of courage, honor, and composure. Recall that in the healthy and luxurious city, the pleasures of drink, sex, and food are inevitable to a large extent. But the guardians should not be taught to praise them or enjoy them. According to common convention, much to be praised is the table that is well laden, and the mixing bowl and cups that are full of delicious wine. But in regards to the education of the guardians, this is bad poetry and a bad example. These prohibitions will end up applying to the people who live within the city walls as well. insofar as they are ruled and aspire to the ideal models promoted by the guardians. Plato gives another excellent example of the type of poetry to be censored when he quotes the tragic poet Aeschylus on Apollo's song at the wedding of Thetis and Peleus. The poem starts out pretty good, saying, "I hope Phoebus's divine mouth will be free of falsehood, endowed with the craft of prophecy, that he will come and sing at the feast and bless us." But it ends appallingly when the very God who should bring blessings is he himself who killed my son. Whenever anyone says such things about a god, we'll be angry at him, refuse him a chorus, and not allow his poetry to be used in the education of the young. And so that our guardians will be as God-fearing and God-like as human beings can be. So summing up the latter parts of Republic 2 and the earlier parts of Republic 3, Plato's basic critique of the poets is that they lie too much and should not be allowed to shape the youth, for there is nothing of the lying poet in the god. Ignorance and madness very often infiltrates into art and culture and is not close to divinity. Both what is daimonic or spiritual and what is divine, the gods and God, are entirely free of falsehood. Short, while we, like the Greeks, love the sinister vivacity of our heroes and the flawed humanity of our gods, for Plato this means idolizing the worst parts of ourselves. Even worse, when we imagine our highest ideals in a flawed mirror, we are deprived of hope. And so in Kallipolis, law will censor incorrect and damaging views about the nature of justice, virtue, and the good, and legislate style and deportment, and even write genre and mode and instrument. Accordingly, even the flute playing in the troupe of Dionysus is banned for Plato. The only music that will be permitted is Apollo's lyre. Culturally, these statements from Plato's about the lying poets have been enormously influential. Even Bjork has a video on this. In the rest of Book 3, we hear about the tripartite division of the city in more detail. That is the three classes: rulers, guardians, and producers or craftsmen, as well as the myth of the metals. That is the origin or genealogy myth, which justifies the tripartite division and the three classes. And it's interesting here, part of the education of the guardians and even of the producers and craftsmen will involve many a noble lie. Very odd indeed, considering Plato just censored the poets for lying, and yet proposes several lies of his own. Clearly, the constitution of the guardian class from which the rulers will be drawn reflects a strong ascetic dimension in Plato's thought. As in this interlude, Socrates, "But tell me, does excessive pleasure share anything in common with temperance? How can it? It sure drives one no less mad than pain does. Can you think of any pleasure that is greater or keener than sexual pleasure? No, I cannot, or of a more insane one either. But isn't the right sort of passion a naturally moderate and musically educated passion for order and beauty?" In short, Plato's entire cosmological, political, and metaphysical theory of justice presented in the Republic is a theory of values, the legislation of some types of values over others. Indeed, a preference for ascetic values and for a moderate or sophrosunic way of life. Plato's discussion of all the dimensions of Kallipolis is very detailed and exhaustive. 405D, he talks about the art of medicine and how it should be used in Kallipolis, as well as the corruption of various medical practitioners. The aim of medicine is health and healing, and we should not need it much except for wounds and seasonal illnesses. Very often the medical industry creates the very illnesses it treats through bad advice and misconceived clinical practice. But the goal of medicine is restoring and preserving health. If someone on account of a bad lifestyle, idleness, and poor diet becomes full of gas and phlegm like a stagnant swamp, such that doctors are compelled to come up with new diagnoses such as flatulence or catarrh to describe these unusual illnesses, this practice is shameful. The healthy regime should not make hypochondriacs or even treat the shameful, according to Plato. Here we find some very disturbing passages which are proto-eugenic. The congenitally sick produce bad offspring and should be let to die off. Asclepius's reputation is redeemed against the Asclepiatic doctors because he was a true man of politics who refused to treat the incurable. These troubling passages definitely influenced Nietzsche's view on physicians of culture. On physical and musical training, or gymnastike and musike, Plato writes that both are needed, and that one is training for the body and the other for the soul. However, exclusively physical training can cause savagery and toughness, and exclusively musical training can turn the soul soft and good for nothing. The goal in both should be courage, temperance, wisdom, and justice in the orderly soul and body. Harshness and feebleness thus both arise when there is any imbalance in training and activity. And just being a warrior is not enough. The warrior needs to find a muse, that is his poetic nature, that his physical regime is harmonized and all his faculties stretched and relaxed to the appropriate degree. These discussions seem to have greatly influenced Aristotle's account of the golden mean, not too little, not too much, but just right, in the Nicomachean Ethics, as we'll see in a couple weeks. Now, only a few of the military guardian class will be selected to be true guardians, the rulers. These will be put through ordeals of sorcery and deception to test what they're made of and how well they retain their education under pressure. These passages have influenced dystopian fiction immensely. Just think of Ender's Game or The Hunger Games, or innumerable other recent similar themed shows. They all go back to 412 to 416 here in Plato's Republic. So what are these noble lies which should be accepted, which will be part of the guardian's education and upbringing? Well, first there's the myth of rebirth. Guardians will be initiated into believing that their upbringing was a dream, and they weren't on Earth yet, but actually down inside the Earth being formed and nurtured. There they will undergo rites of rebirth as they graduate into true guardians and citizens. These parts of the education of guardians may seem strange to us as noble lies, but notice how they're part of the structure of initiation in indigenous societies. An anthropologist might note here rites of passage to manhood involving a transition, a liminal phase, and a new social status very often involve noble lies like this and complex ritual initiations globally. Once graduated into adulthood, to keep people in their places and explain why sometimes children are reassigned to new classes, they will be told that they are all related but exist in different castes, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, based on the amount of metal in their blood. For Plato, these lies should be believed by tradition and never questioned. Comparative Indo-European scholars have noted here that this type of caste system is a nearly universal feature of Indo-European societies. Here in Plato, it involves a modification of Hesiod's myth of the 5 ages, but its import is actually more closely akin to the law books of Manu in India. In a way, Plato is attempting to retrieve archaic Indo-European social structure over and against Greek democracy. His project is at least in part culturally atavistic. Book 4 begins to bring the argument together and covers 4 main topics: the virtues of the good city, the tripartite soul, the virtues of the soul, and justice in the soul. And here Plato attempts to respond to a preliminary objection. Recall how good life in the healthy and luxurious city sounded? Can we really expect the guardians to see that happening in the city and not to wish it for themselves? Won't they be unhappy? According to Plato, no, they'll actually be the happiest because their life will be the best on the whole. And I can see some logic to this. They're the most physically fit and capable, and also the only ones receiving instruction in music, thus the most spiritually advanced. Then why would they want a life devoted to instinctual pleasures? No, they won't envy the regular citizens their luxuries, but rather help to curb them to moderation. There won't need to be as many guardians and auxiliaries as you might imagine, the true guardians being these higher graduates and the auxiliaries being the military class, because they'll be superior warriors capable of strategy and defeating many. In other words, the guardians and auxiliaries will be like super warriors, the most incredible ninja samurais the world has ever seen, and also deeply soulful and spiritual. They sound a bit like Marvel comic superheroes minus the staunch individuality. Now, according to Plato, the city's size will be limited by the requirements of its unity. It can continue to grow, but only within the limits of remaining one city-state. At this point, another weird and quasi-fascistic point comes up. What if a larger and more powerful city is intent on destroying Kallipolis, which remains too small? This is, of course, a serious problem. Although the Greeks were successful in fending off the much larger Persian Empire, clearly larger political unities are a threat. The inevitability of the transition from the city-state to empires doesn't seem to have occurred to Plato here. His answer to this worry is a little chilling. I know Kallipolis will offer its services as mercenaries to other cities in exchange for additional protection. Good move, Plato. Having just ensured that your guardians and auxiliaries are raised in a just and moral life, you're now offering their services as mercenaries? Clearly, the friend-enemy distinction and the idea that justice is only for friends and not for enemies is still part of Plato's own thinking at this point. Warriors, he imagines, are so fierce that no other city-state would choose to fight hard, lean hounds like this, rather than to join the hounds in fighting fat and tender sheep. This is certainly a fascioid will to power and rule of the stronger, indeed, still within Plato's own argument. On the whole, the culture of Kallipolis will be intensely conservative, everything occurring by ancestral custom. Where you see a change to a new kind of musical training is something to beware of as wholly dangerous, for one can never change the ways of training people in musicae without affecting the greatest political laws. Note here this intimate connection between musicae as culture and nomos or politics, that is, of the aesthetic and the ethico-political. Modern societies have severed this link, but for Plato they were taken as granted and self-evident. Next, another interesting point that Aristotle will take issue with. Although intensely conservative, Kallipolis, according to Plato, won't need to legislate the details of everyday life. Being set up in the right way in terms of classes and education, people will simply learn the best ways and follow them from childhood. There won't need to be many laws to regulate the everyday activity of citizens, because they'll simply be good, nice, and kind. The principal significance of this part of Plato's theory of education is its focus on early childhood development. Children are raised right, they'll become good. If raised bad, the people will be bad for life. Care for the elders and parents, and even proper hairstyle and dress will come naturally to these good Kallipolians. And they certainly won't engage in futile lawsuits against each other. Law or the legal system will be less about adjudicating competing claims and more about establishing norms in tricky limit cases. And incorrigible people will be excised from the social body and put to death. This is clearly zero-tolerance policy towards criminals, very far from the modern recognition of the need for their humane treatment. Religion will be reformed in Kallipolis, but will continue to conform to the most ancient customs. Notice that Plato is not rejecting all aspects of the ancestral Greek religion. In fact, he underlines the authority of the Delphic Apollo as something that will continue in Kallipolis. And so there you have it, Kallipolis, beta version. A just city, no? Sorry, Socrates, says Glycon and Adamantus. Please explain why it's just. Having established the constitution, classes, and way of life of the various classes of the citizenry, the onus is now on Plato to explain, according to his method of analogy, how the letters of justice can be more clearly discerned in such a city. Macrocosm has been established, and now we must look to the microcosm, that is, to the inner world or soul, to see if the comparison of justice in the city with justice in the soul confirms the rectitude of the establishment of Kallipolis so far. At this point, Socrates explains the chief virtues of wisdom, courage, and temperance in detail, both in Kallipolis as a whole and in terms of the relation of the guardian class to regular citizens. And he introduces another metaphor to test whether justice has been established, that is the metaphor of the dyed wool. A white piece of cloth needs to be treated extensively before being dipped in a dye if the color is to take. The white cloth, of course, is Kallipolis itself, and the color is justice. Has the color taken to Kallipolis? In order to determine that at the level of the city, we must also look to justice at the level of the soul. And here Plato introduces his highly influential theory of a tripartite soul. The soul is in fact not one thing, but a multiplicity, primarily of three parts. The highest rational part, our reason, our judgment. The spirited part, our anger, ambition, courage, honor, etc. And the appetitive part, desiring food, sex, comfort. Of course, these three parts are going to map onto the three classes of Kallipolis. Notice as well the chauvinism and Greek cultural mores built into this very articulation of the tripartite soul. Alas, pleasures, pains, and appetites that are numerous and multifarious are things one would expect to find in children, women, household slaves, and in so-called free members of the masses, that is, the inferior people. Taking the three chief virtues of the good city to be wisdom, courage, and moderation, Plato notes that wisdom is best expressed in knowing how best to serve the city and rule it, that is, the rulers and the guardians, that spirit or honor should be tempered by reason, and taught perseverance in the face of fear, and this will be the chief virtue of the second class of guardians, the auxiliaries or soldiers. Moderation is defined both psychologically and politically as order and harmony between the parts of the soul or the parts of the city, and so is defined on the whole in terms of the well-ordered society, that is, including the producers. And the question now becomes how we can observe justice in this tripartite division of the soul and the city. Definition of justice now being given as that of doing one's work or performing one's role well and not doing anyone else's work. In theory, justice should be an effect of the proper functioning of the three levels of the soul and the three classes. The most proper virtue of the soul becoming justice itself, but we're not really sure if it's instantiated yet in each individual in a city like this. So Plato goes on, the definition of justice that sticks here like the die and constitutes the first solid definition of justice upon which the rest of the Republic builds, is justice as having and doing of one's own and what belongs to one, i.e. being and doing appropriately. This is an answer to Thrasymachus' question, what if justice is merely in the interests of the powerful? By analogy, just as justice in the city is each part performing its natural role, we should expect the soul to be just in the same way. Justice in the soul is each part doing its function well, with the rational part ruling, the spirited part motivating good action, and the appetitive part being ruled by the rational and spirited one. Injustice in the soul amounts to civil war or revolution in Kallipolis. So Plato here transitions from the macrocosm to the microcosm and also to logic. His proof that the soul is tripartite is the microcosm of the three classes, but seems to require more finesse. This topic is deemed to be of greater difficulty. For are there really three parts of the soul, and how could we possibly know this? Quote, this is what is difficult to determine in a way that is up to the standards of our argument. It is clear that the same thing cannot do or undergo opposite things, not at any rate in the same respect and in relation to the same thing and at the same time. This is a logical principle now applied in order to prove the doctrine of the parts of the soul. Can we be sure that the soul is tripartite? Simply by applying this logical principle to each of its activities. Hunger is one of the activities of the soul, and its aim is nourishment. The aim of spiritedness is expression of emotion, and the aim of reason is to govern an order. And so it is interesting that here Platonic epistemology is invented in order to argue more convincingly for the doctrine of the tripartite soul. In fact, the latter parts of Book 4 and first parts of Book 5, sometimes seen by scholars as the origin of the discipline of logic and of epistemology in ancient Greek philosophy. You can read more about this in the work of John Sallis, for example. What is epistemology, theory of knowledge? Well, episteme is one of the names for knowledge in ancient Greek philosophy. Its linguistic root comes from the Greek verb epistasthai, literally to know, understand, from epi, over and near, and histasthai, to stand or overstand. It doesn't come into circulation as a basic name for knowledge in ancient philosophy until Plato and Aristotle. And it doesn't come into existence as a truly separate discipline within philosophy until the modern period, that is after René Descartes. In Book 4, 435b, Plato presents not a formal logic per se, such as we'll find in Aristotle, but something resembling formal logical principles, and arguing that these arise from the rational part of the soul. The example given is the spinning top. For of course, we say the same thing would not perform opposed actions concerning the same thing at the same time. Childlike or irrational understanding, it looks like a miracle. How is it standing still and moving at the same time? Applying this logical principle, however, resolves the difficulty. The spinning top is standing still with respect to its axis and moving with respect to its circumference. Plato's logical principle and example here could be understood as an early statement of the logical principle of identity. A equals A and not A. Each thing is the same as itself and different from another. And this principle is further developed in Plato's Theaetetus. There are also protoforms here of the other two principles of formal logic, non-contradiction and excluded middle. In a way, logic is invented in order to justify the doctrine of the tripartite soul. For using these principles of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle, Plato distinguishes different simultaneous states of the soul and demonstrates that they originate in different faculties. We indeed find ourselves conflicted, our appetites wanting or approving what reason rejects and disapproves of, and finding that the spirited parts of our nature can always go either way, either towards virtue or what reason dictates, or towards vice, what the appetites desire. But by nature and definition, the rational part cannot endorse bad appetites. In other words, basic logical principles have been used to demonstrate on the basis of our behavior that the soul is not a unity. However, it should be governed by the best part, to which the spirit should ally itself, such as Leotrophides' necrophilia, where the appetitive part of the soul overruns the spirited and rational part. This is one of the first discussions of the fetish in ancient Greek philosophy and would be worthy of a long discussion. Plato also seeks demonstrations from childhood psychology. For example, children who are spirited from birth but never really learn to be rational. Children in whom there simply is no spirited or rational element, who are just plain unteachable, slaves to destructive appetites and negative passions. There's not only some logical proof here, but also empirical verification of the theory. Conclusion of Book 4, we hear how the productive, auxiliary, and deliberative classes map perfectly onto the appetite of spirited and rational soul. Accordingly, the plan created for Kallipolis is according to nature, and the demonstration of the tripartite soul cements the plan's intrinsic rationality. Furthermore, if people are raised towards wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, each doing what is appropriate for them to do, or at least ruled over by these virtues, then the city as a whole will be virtuous, well-ordered, and just. Again, citizens will hardly think to commit heinous crimes because they will have been well-educated. Crime and impiety will be virtually abolished. 443c, the dream we had has been completely fulfilled then. I mean, the suspicion we expressed right from the beginning when we were founding the city, we had, with the help of some god, chanced to hit upon the origin and the pattern of justice. It is at this point that the long digressions of books 5 to 7 begin. That is, in terms of a particularly thorny problem of women, marriage, and child-rearing. Socrates wants to go on at this point and discuss the 5 types of constitutions and thus the 5 types of souls, and to give a theory of personality types and respective political regimes in which they are expressed. This topic won't be returned to until Book 8 of the Republic. Rather, what ensues is a long and fruitful digression, in which we get Plato's core teachings on epistemology and metaphysics, part of his philosophy of education. But before these parts of the dialogue are presented, we get the strongest source of objections to Socrates, and the demand to explicate a single unexplicated sentence from earlier in the dialogue. Whoa boy, wait a minute there, Socrates. Don't think we forgot what was mentioned earlier as regards to women and children. It will be a case of friends sharing everything in common. What on earth could this mean? Recalling his trembling in the face of Thrasymachus' argument at the beginning of the dialogue, Socrates is now positively flustered, and thus at his weakest. What a swarm of arguments you are now stirring up by making this demand. Is Kallipolis even possible? If even Socrates is uncertain about it and searching for it, and even frightened and insecure of his own conclusions? Why is Socrates so flustered? Here begins the discussion of women in the dialogue, the more in-depth account of why they should perform all the same roles as men according to their nature and abilities, given the same education and even to exercise naked as the men do. This is certainly not a popular opinion in Greek culture at the time. And what follows, to Plato's credit, the full 10-page discussion on the social construction of gender and identity roles. For Socrates and Plato, our customs should be rational, not merely traditional. Our understanding of women's roles in society should be based on sound argument, not heuristics. For the purposes of a well-ordered society, particular women and particular men should be ranked according to their natural capabilities, not by any abstract participation in a general category. And often, women can produce various tasks better than men, and women should even be guardians. These points in themselves are not what's raising all the controversy, however, but rather the doctrine of sex and marriage presented by Socrates. And because they have shared dwellings and meals, and none of them has any private property of any sort, they will live together, and through mixing together in the gymnasia and in the rest of their daily life, they will be driven by an inborn compulsion, I take it, to have sex with one another. Or don't you think I'm talking about necessities here? Plato seems to realize here he can't stop people from having sex with each other. And he even affirms that they might do so willy-nilly, often in disregard for social class, and perhaps encouraged to do so by the fact that women and children are held in common. Plato's doctrine of marriage is thus produced with an explicit view to childbirth. Only marriages with a view to childbirth arranged by the rulers will be permitted, and the better the couplings between exemplary individuals of their class, the more sacred the child. Note, these are not marriages in the traditional sense, but rather ceremonial couplings. In fact, all citizens will be bred like livestock with a view to the desired qualities and classes of the offspring. Indeed, all unauthorized children will be disposed of by their parents in secret. The legal children will be raised in common by their respective classes. Sex before and after the breeding years, before 20 for men and women and after 40 for women and 55 for men, will not be regulated, but no children from those unions will be permitted to be brought forth into the light of day. Incest is prohibited except in the case of brother and sister, and the men with the best qualities will get the most sex with the goal of producing as many children as possible. Mothers will not know who their children are, so that favoritism is avoided. In a nutshell, Plato promotes institutionalized polyamory, widespread infanticide, and state-controlled childbirth and childrearing. It's not hard to see how even Aristotle considers these arguments dangerous in his Politics. On polyamory, Plato asks, doesn't privatization of these things dissolve the city? Do not phrases like mine and not mine sow dissension? Thus we have shown that the cause of the greatest good for our city is the sharing of women and children by the auxiliaries. And the same goes with good-looking boys. Their kisses will be a reward for bravery. Plato, I can sort of see that as a noble ideal, but you're probably taking it a bit far, no? On heroic myth and the ethics of battle, we hear that those who died distinguished on the battlefield will be celebrated as the gold of their race. Traditional hero worship at grave sites will be preserved to honor the unsullied daimons of great individuals, and a strict distinction will be made in battle between factional disputes within Greece and a war against external enemies. Kallipolis will love the Greek people as a whole and aim for the unity of the Greek people across factions. And when war against fellow Greeks is inevitable, Kallipolis will not burn their houses or otherwise create lasting enmity. Furthermore, Kallipolis will continue to participate in the pan-Hellenic religious festivals. These are all very interesting points which bring Kallipolis from a utopian fiction down to earth in the Hellenic context. Not only will Kallipolis continue to worship the Delphic Apollo and see it as definitive, but it won't shun the other cities of Greece. Rather, in being the most excellent, it will shine at all the religious festivals throughout the annual calendar, generally encourage all the Greek city-states to model itself on it. And at this point, Plato introduces the most well-known and controversial claim in the whole of the Republic, until philosophers rule as kings in their city, or those who are nowadays called kings and leading men become genuine and adequate philosophers, so that political power and philosophy become thoroughly blended together, while the numerous natures that now pursue either one exclusively are forcibly prevented from doing so. Cities will have no rest from evils, my dear Glykon, nor, I think, will the human race. In fact, any city that is not yet ruled by philosophers is as still underground, pre-Platonic enlightenment as it were, and without any happiness either in the public or the private sphere. At this point, the ruler-ruled or leader-follower distinction is framed around philosophers as leaders and rulers, and only a very few will be philosophers. So what is the philosopher according to Plato's Republic? Simply a lover of wisdom in all its forms. The nature of a lover is to love all exemplars of a particular type. There are lovers of beautiful boys, there are lovers of good music, of excellent wine, and of Dionysian festivals, and each is an expert in what they love and pursue it relentlessly. The philosopher is distinguished because his appetite is for the whole of wisdom, his insatiability for learning. Anyone who is insatiable for anything is like the philosopher in some sense, but that's as far as it goes. Only philosophers are truly lovers of seeing the truth, and they are those who can see the beautiful itself beyond all the specific instances of beautiful things. They are like those who are awake rather than merely dreaming and opining. Within the discussion of the philosopher and philosophic nature, the Republic shifts as a whole from Kallipolis and its politics to the essence of knowledge and reality. Just as earlier a proto-form of principles of logic had guided the demonstration of the tripartite soul, now we get definitions of the very nature of knowledge and reality. That is, the relation between episteme, knowing or understanding or insight, to noesis, that is thinking, the mind or intelligence. Episteme and noesis are not separated in Plato's thinking. What is significant is that he charts a development from episteme, trying to find out what we know and why, the Socratic element, towards noesis, cognizing reality or the forms themselves. This is the Platonic contribution. In fact, Plato's theory of forms itself has and is presented in different aspects: an epistemological aspect, knowledge as related to eternal truths, and how we can uncover it; a metaphysical aspect, reality itself in which every instance participates, the forms; and occasionally, although not as much in the Republic, there's an emphasis on the semantic and religious aspect of the theory of forms. Aristotle will extensively pursue these semantic elements, how pluralities are gathered under a single name. In the end, the first three aspects of the forms are subordinate for Plato to the religious aspect, as we'll see in the Myth of Air at the end of the Republic. So, according to Book 5 of Plato's Republic, knowledge, episteme, is a relation of the human mind to the beings that are, the ti onti or to on. Knowledge is in essence a remembering of what is real, an anamnesis. This is the subjective dimension of knowing, but knowing is also an understanding, a remembering or of the known, the noema or objective dimension. What is knowable within the faculty of knowledge is for Plato reality itself. Ultimately, only the forms or ideas are actually knowable. So if knowledge is a knowing of what is knowable, reality itself, the ideas, what is not knowing or ignorance? Ignorance, anoia, literally means not knowing. And Plato defines it as a relation of the mind to what is not, meonti, meon. The ignorant person cognizes not truths, but shadowy reflections. And here we get the first hint in the Republic of the later metaphor or allegory of the cave, and the cave dwellers who are mired in ignorance with respect to the truth of their situation. Plato distinguishes here philosophers, lovers of knowledge, that is, who know what is, being always the same in all respects, versus the lovers of opinion, that is, of belief, a realm of what is and what is not, like in Parmenides, and a mixture of both, therefore a realm of pure appearance. We can imagine here that some of the guardian class will be lovers of correct belief, philodoxers, whereas only the true guardians will be philosophers in this sense. Some element of knowledge and belief will obviously also exist among the producer class, but the producer class will indeed need correct beliefs in order to guide its behavior. At the same time, it's in the city itself that ignorance, that is a relation to what is not, will predominate. Plato's epistemology as well maps onto the tripartite soul and the three classes of Kallipolis. He goes on, if knowing means perceiving beings as they are, and non-knowing means perceiving things that are not, then between knowing and non-knowing there are two phenomena, belief and opinion. What is belief? It is defined very elegantly in the Republic as more shadowy than knowledge, skotodesteron, but clearer, phanatai, than ignorance. More simply, our beliefs concern both things that are true, for example, the theory of geocentrism, and things that are not true, like Santa Claus. Furthermore, just having a true belief is not sufficient for knowledge. This is the first genuinely epistemological theory in Western philosophy. Because of its vacillating relation to truth and falsity, Plato defines belief as a wandering in-between realm grasped by an in-between power. Again, most influenced here by Parmenides. Why doesn't having true beliefs suffice for knowledge? Consider this Venn diagram. Here are all your beliefs which are not truths. Here are all your true beliefs in the purple. But just having true beliefs isn't sufficient for knowledge. Something extra is needed such that you know that your belief is true. Plato leaves these issues hanging a bit in the Republic, but in the Theaetetus he returns to them and defines knowledge as justified true belief. You have to know why your beliefs are true, and this requires some form of justification. Exactly what forms of justification count, rational argument or factual evidence? Some combination of both will of course be a theme running across the history of philosophy, with its competing tendencies of transcendentalism and empiricism. Now Plato goes on here to define knowledge as a power or faculty of the soul. Knowing, believing, also feeling, intuiting, sensing, perceiving, understanding are powers, dunamai, potentialities of the soul, capacities for something. And potentialities, or dunamis, are thought as a type of thing that enables us to do whatever we are to do. More modern philosophy, especially post-Kantian, calls these the faculties. Already in Plato's Republic, episteme, knowing, is the most powerful faculty that there is. And of course, it is only in the philosophers that this powerful faculty of episteme will predominate. How does it come to be that knowledge becomes the most beloved thing for the philosopher? Again, a little bit of Platonic psychology. This is because of the philosopher's high-mindedness. In fact, small-mindedness, smicrologia, is altogether incompatible with that quality in a soul that is always reaching out to grasp things as a whole. And do you imagine that a thinker, a dianoa, who is high-minded, megaloprepia, enough to gaze at all time and all being, will consider human life to be a very great thing? Philosophers must be great or high-minded, megaloprepia. They must have keen sight for the forms, as well as a clear model in their soul of everything that should be realized in accordance with reality. Quote, let's agree that philosophical natures always love the sort of learning that makes clear to them some feature of the being that always is, the I ousias, and does not wander around in coming to be and decay, in the realm of genesis and phthora, mere becoming and evanescence. Philosophical natures are in this way truthful, asoudian, and do not tolerate falsehood in any form. They have only affection for wisdom and truth, as well as a knack for sniffing out the deceitful and counterfeit. Ultimately, philosophers look at all time and all being. They are just and gentle, quick learners, and possess good memories. So let's never include a person with a forgetful soul among those who are sufficiently philosophical. The one we look for should be good at remembering. And they will also be musical and graceful and have an innate sense of proportion. In short, the philosopher is good at remembering, quick to learn, high-minded, graceful, and a friend and relative of truth, justice, courage, and temperance. Adeimantus objects, but Socrates, how can we entrust the city to philosophers when so many of them are led astray by argument, quibblers, trapped in ideology, and dabblers? In fact, the majority become cranks, not to say completely bad, while the ones who seem best are rendered useless to the city because of the pursuit you recommend. Socrates' reply here is that may be true at the moment, but we should consider such people not to be true philosophers at all. The philosophers today are a lot like the people in the city in their relationship to the true philosopher. That is, like bad sailors with respect to the authentic captain. They mutiny, enfeeble the captain with mandragoras and drink, meanwhile rioting, looting, and feasting instead, calling the true captain a stargazer, a useless babbler, and a good-for-nothing. Now, naturally, philosophers will appear useless to the masses since they are under the influence of bad rulers. Good philosophers are very rare in our current social conditions. Furthermore, the few good philosophers who exist will reject participation in badly ruled cities as futile, and they don't seek power, but rather cultivate a private life and work, like the historical Socrates. Most philosophical natures are in fact susceptible to corruption in a bad city. This is precisely because they are exceptional. They have the potential to excel in goodness and truth, but end up excelling in badness. The sophists can barely be called philosophers because they know their place and don't upset the status quo. And in this sense, they are like trainers of the huge, strong beast, of people who live according to Thrasymachus' way of thinking in current Athens. In the end, the realist of all philosophers will be put on trial. This is an allusion to Socrates, and even the most philosophical natures, an allusion to Alcibiades, will be swayed by bad influence to pretension and empty, senseless pride. Under such conditions, the few philosophers that are left will probably only become philosophical on account of some disability or a bridle of some kind, such as a physical illness or an unsuitability to the ways of the bad polis, or in Socrates' case, a demonic sign. Those who have become members of this little group of philosophers have tasted how sweet and blessed a possession philosophy is. At the same time, they have also seen the insanity of the masses and realized that there is nothing healthy in public affairs. In other words, philosophers have barely survived in the current world, but they would thrive better under a better constitution and form of government. Part of the problem for Plato is that philosophy is currently pursued as mere sophistics in argument, definition, and heuristics, but true philosophy is the fruit of maturity and of a life well lived. Even Thrasymachus should be considered the friend of the true philosopher here for having instigated the discussion of the Republic. The only reason why Thrasymachus continues to believe that justice is merely the rule of the stronger is because he's never seen a man that matched our plan. That is a philosopher king as someone whose whole life is harmonious and rhythmed in virtue. This is the moment most of all in the Republic where Plato says, "Behold the man," or ecce homo, the philosopher king, and this is thus the most significant precursor idea even for Nietzsche's idea of the overman. Concerning the philosophical nature and its love of learning, of what always is, ever wandering around and coming to being and decay, Plato goes on in a transition now from knowledge to reality. Think of the soul in this way. When it focuses on something that is illuminated, katalampai, both by truth and what is, it fathoms, thinks, and manifestly possesses intelligence. But when it focuses on what is mixed with obscurity, what comes to be and passes away, it believes and is dimmed and changes its beliefs one way or another and appears to be lost to intelligence. In other words, the essence of the philosophical nature is to be constantly in relationship with being and what is. How difficult is it going to be to establish philosopher rulers as the guardians of all public education? Not impossible, according to Plato, but very, very difficult. First of all, they must enlist the help of the masses, the demos. Most of the demos is rife with prejudices about philosophers and philosophy. However, and this is very optimistic on Plato's part, the people are teachable. I will anticipate you and say that I think a few people may have such a harsh character, but not the majority. How do we help the demos to be better? So that it becomes more teachable and amenable to rule by philosophy? Well, we always become like and imitate that which we admire. The people must be trained to admire what is truly admirable. And this is how one changes public opinion towards philosophers, improving both the people and the philosophers. We must show the people the likeness of the philosophers, just like Homer did for the divine human in the Iliad. On the rarest of philosophical natures, Plato again underlines the qualities of ease of learning, good memory, astuteness and smartness, plus youthful passion and high-mindedness. Such qualities are rarely willing to grow altogether. Charisma and wit tend to eclipse order, tranquility, and stability in many natures. Accordingly, truly philosophical natures will be exceedingly rare. They must be tested not only with labors, fears, and pleasures, that is, in those initiations discussed earlier, but also they must be tested on the most important subjects. And here Plato pivots to note that his discussion of the education of the guardians previously was not complete, most people being too lazy to even have realized that a better account was needed. At this point, Plato is selecting his audience a bit and egging them on to finish reading the Republic. He doesn't even return to his account of the best and highest education up until books 7 to 8. His account of the essence of the true education of the philosopher begins once the definition of knowledge is provided with a call to the forms themselves. So then, bearing all that in mind, recall our earlier question. Can the majority in any way tolerate or accept that the beautiful itself as opposed to the many beautiful things, or each thing itself as opposed to the corresponding many, exists? We said, I believe, that in order to get the finest view of these matters, there is a longer road, and if one travels it, they become clear. It becomes possible to give demonstrations that would be up to the standards of the previous discussion. In this way, Plato fully integrates his metaphysics, or theory of the forms, within the overall argument on justice. For what does justice in the city and the soul rest on, if not the good itself, that is, the form of good, as a form even greater than justice? What is the most important subject for the education of the philosopher? Answer, the good itself. You see, you have often heard it said that the form of the good is the greatest thing to learn about, and that it is by their relation to it that just things and others become useful and beneficial. And if we do not know it, that is the good, you know that even the fullest possible knowledge of other things is of no benefit, any more than if we acquire any possession without the good. But what is this highest good, the good itself? Surely it's not pleasure. The idea that the good itself could be pleasure is for Plato here a bad omen, not to be countenanced. If it's not pleasure, what then is the good itself? Introducing this topic of the good itself, yet a single quote from Plato at 505c. How could it not be when they blame us for not knowing the good and then turn around and talk to us as if we did know it? I mean, they say it is knowledge of the good, as if we understood what they mean when they utter the word good. The definition of the good itself is indeed very difficult. We can compare here Plato's Sophist at 244a, the epigraph of Heidegger's Being and Time, as a very similar statement. For manifestly, you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed. In short, we don't yet understand what the good itself is, even though we talk about it every day as if we did, nor do we understand what being itself is, even though similarly we say is every day, while giving it no further thought. What Plato's Socrates, now fully a mouthpiece, is going to try to explain is what the good itself is. Here, the danger of giving an illegitimate account, that is a tokos or false argument, has never been greater. And what follows from this core question and constitutes the most famous part of the Republic is the analogy of the sun, the divided line, and the myth of the cave. The two central quotes for the analogy of the sun: and doesn't it, the eye, receive the power it has from the sun for sight, just like the influx from an overflowing treasure? Yet the sun is not sight either, but as its cause, isn't it seen by sight itself? Let's say then that this is what I called the offspring of the good, which the good begot as its analog or analogon. What the latter is in the intelligible realm, the noetu topon, in relation to intelligence and intelligible things, the former is in the visible realm in relation to sight and visible things. More simply, the sun shines, it's the source of the sensible world and the sight which perceives it, just as the good shines, which is the source of the intelligible world and the intelligence that knows it. Press pause here, take a good long moment to reread and understand the analogy of the sun. The Platonic image of thought is by analogy, just as we needed to identify the just state so as by analogy to discover the nature of justice in the soul. So when it comes to the good itself, we cannot understand it straight away, but must approach it by means of an analogy. The significance of the analogy of the sun in Plato's Metaphysics here is that more than anywhere else, it clearly presents the hypothesis of two worlds, a sensible world and an intellectual one. So far as things like justice itself, truth itself, beauty itself, and above all, the good itself exist, they are not visible to sight. They are in fact invisible forms, which operate in the world on analogy to the sun, as that which enables the efficient functioning or visibility and knowability of anything else. The sun is the light that connects what is seen with the seer, just as the good is the meta-principle which connects the many in one form. Given the analogy of the sun, what is the good? Plato, you must say then, what gives truth to the things known and the power of evidence to the knower is the form of the good. To understand this, we can first look at its counterpoint. What would the world be like if there was nothing at all that could give truth to the things known, and nothing at all that could give power to know to the knower? Well, the world would then be endless illusions wrapped in illusions, appearances cloaked in appearances, an endless maze with no center, no thing itself, no truth, and no knowledge. In other words, as John Protevi underlines in his notes on Plato's Republic, the good functions as the meta-principle of systematic function enabled by the proper part-whole relations. The good doesn't explain things, but explains how principles explain things. More precisely, the good explains how principles fit together, how they explain parts of a whole that when properly arranged allows a systematic functioning. Protevi helpfully gives the example of the cooperation of plants and animals in trading oxygen and carbon dioxide as what allows the ecosystem to function. Creates this beneficent symbiotic relationship is, in Platonic terms, the good as the meta-principle of systematic functioning. And it is also the origin of the telos that we see instantiated in proper part-whole relationships. In fact, in moving from the sun analogy to the good, Plato believes he's moved beyond even being itself. The good transcends existence or the being of beings. It is what gives being, gives any given being its particular impetus and role in the cosmic whole. Just as the sun illuminates, bestowing the ability to see and be seen by the eye, so the idea of goodness illumines the intelligible, the truth. And thus for Plato, the good is not being, but something yet beyond being, epikainates ousias, superior even to being in rank and power. Glaucon replies ridiculously, by Apollo, what daimonic hyperbole? For if the good is beyond being, how can it even be said to exist? How are being and non-being even related in the good? In order to explain this extremely difficult philosophical question, Plato now turns to the divided line and the allegory of the cave. Of course, the good as a meta-principle functions within Plato's teleology. Things emerge from the forms and their destination is the supersensible world of the forms. The good guarantees and underwrites all things in the cosmos. Without the good, all things would have no foundation. We could return here to the pre-Socratics, who posit the origin and essence of the multiplicity in terms of a single substance, which is eventually called the arche, or commencement and commandment of all things in the world. In Plato, the arche is not only the world of the forms or the supersensible, but more specifically, we need a ground of explanation for why the forms themselves exist and how they are related to each other. Lacking such a principle, even for the world of the forms, the very existence of such a supersensible realm comes into question. Plato's system as a whole is grounded in the good as arche, an unfathomably profound ground that is deeper even than the being of things, that is, their form. With this in mind, we can look to various breakdowns of the divided line and see how they provide us with a picture of Plato's ultimate ontology, rooted not just in being itself or the being of beings, but in the good which transcends being and gives it. First instance, Plato's divided line has two parts: the eternal material realm and the temporary sensory material realm, or the visible and the intellectual realm. Within the visible realm, two basic faculties of the soul predominate: akasia, imagination, and pistis, opinion or believing. Locked wholly in the visible realm, we barely think, that is, barely explore the forms or definitions of things and their true reality. But when we cross the middle of the divided line, we enter in the realm of thinking or dianoia, that is, understanding the relation of the forms to each other. When we do this, we enter into a higher kind of thinking, that is noesis, understanding the forms themselves, and thus metaphysically understanding the world of being and thus the being of beings. Even more comprehensively broken down, this diagram of the divided line shows how in the world of imagining or perceiving, we're always in the realm of mirror images, reflections, and shadows, in a wholly unenlightened state of mind, which takes the sensible appearances of the world at face value. This is the situation of the cave dwellers, as we'll see in a moment. Transcending upon this, we enter the world of belief or of faith and conviction. That is common sense knowledge, correct moral teachings, and more or less everything you need to get around in the world. The first entry into the world of philosophy or science involves empirical generalizations or hypotheses constructed on the basis of appearances, the purest form of which is applied mathematics. This leads us in thinking or understanding to pure mathematics, which is in Plato not only mathematical knowledge of number, but a mathesis or mathematical knowledge of the inner relationship of the various forms. Thinking thus draws us nearer to the forms and bridges the world of opinion to the world of knowledge. And this is the training of the guardians. Eventually, this training leads to genuine intelligence, wisdom, reason, and mastery in dialectic. Here, noesis, intelligence, or rational intuition is freed by the acquisition of truth or knowledge, episteme, and we are able at last to give an account or logos of some particular form. Ultimately, this type of knowledge, knowing the forms of things, is grounded in the form of the good itself, without which such intelligence would be impossible or arbitrary. So even that last diagram isn't quite correct insofar as it talks about mathematics, applied mathematics, but the mathematical objects themselves in Plato are the forms, not number. Only through a knowledge of the forms and an ability to comprehend them in their unity and multiplicity do we eventually ascend to first principles. That is, strict definitions of the forms and understanding of their inner relation through noesis, intellectual intuition. Difficult stuff, but let's review this through quotes from the actual dialogue. 1.1 is the first stage of the divided line, or the realm of fragmentary perceptions. As Plato explains, in terms now of relative clarity and opacity, you will have one subsection of the visible that is images, ikones. By images, I mean first shadows, then reflections in the bodies of water, and in all closed, packed, smooth, shiny materials, and everything of that sort. In the first instance, we enter into a world of pure phenomena, or appearance. The condition of possibility for the formation of beliefs or opinions involves the hypothesis of actual things which underline these perceptions. Then, in the other subsection of the visible, put the originals of these images, that is, the animals around us, every plant, and the whole class of manufactured things. The world is not merely a play of appearances, but appearances of something, of things. These are the things we study when we study the empirical world, speculating about similarities and differences, likenesses and unlikenesses, and thus speculating about the forms that are common to the many things. As we transition into thinking itself and intelligence, At first, we arrive at the principal causes of things, which for Plato are the ideas. Quote, next consider how the section of the intelligible is to be divided. In one subsection, the soul or psyche, using as images the things that were imitated before, is compelled to base its inquiry on hypothesis, proceeding not to a first beginning, but to a final end. Before we know the form itself and are able to answer the question, what is it? What is truth? What is justice? We are first groping towards in thinking all the hypotheses concerning justice that have been presented across the Republic so far. We have not yet, at this stage of the divided line, acquired the first beginning or arcane of justice, but rather are working back from the ends of justice, that is, from its manifestations in the world, or its modeling in the macrocosm that is Kallipolis. When we learn to think both about the empirical world and about the forms themselves, we do so always on the basis of hypotheses. For Plato, this word means what lies under and supports what manifests itself, hypothesis. And pre-Socratic philosophers hypothesized and argued about whether the ground of nature, physis, the whole of beings, is one such thing or another, the infinite, air, water, fire, or mind. Modern science as well constantly tests and revises its hypotheses without necessarily presuming a Platonic theory of forms, and so progress in science is more empirical, yet still situatable within the divided line. Science exists almost wholly within the interplay between the objects themselves and their mathematization through thought. What Plato is going to try to do here is get us beyond even science, to the forms themselves. When we reason about the empirical world, we're reasoning in a scientific way. Knowledge of any given science being founded in a body of hypotheses that are in a more or less constant process of revision and self-reflection based on evidence and interpretation. This model of science corresponds to Plato's third section of the divided line, above mere images and opinions, and in the realm of a more methodical, cognitive systematizing of the real images of the world in terms of their origins and ends. In fact, modern scientific hypotheses continue to operate precisely according to the definition of hypothesis that we find in Plato's Republic. So the whole of science as reasoning about the world has not yet attained, in the Platonic sense, transition to the highest intelligible. For more than expressing competing hypotheses like the pre-Socratics or modern scientists, Plato thinks there is a mode of thinking that gains a mediated access to the very being of beings. Such a thinking is able to explain all worldly appearances in terms of a network of hypotheses which encompass the origin and end of every form in this appearance and that. This will come to be known in modern philosophy as a priori thinking and will continue to underline rationalist philosophies. Now note that even explaining the visible world of the forms in terms of invisible principles doesn't get us all the way to the highest intelligible itself. The highest intelligible is only accessible when the soul makes its way to an unhypothetical first principle, that is, when the soul comprehends the arche. Here it must gain access to a hypothesis not rooted in worldly images, not rooted in the world. It is not an X-type. It learns to use the forms themselves and to make its methodical inquiry through the forms. This is the a priori as such, and provides us with Plato's doctrine of transcendental reasoning. The method of the empirical sciences is insufficiently equipped to speak to the final section of the divided line where Plato addresses these unhypothetical first principles. We do not hypothesize about the good, rather the good and other forms are what underlines all our hypothesizing. The first principles are ultimately the self-showing forms themselves, and even more deeply, the form of the good. And here the philosopher turns from reasoning about the empirical world to reasoning in and from a supersensible reality. Plato's model of knowledge is that of the philosopher who uses his rational faculties to gain access to a world that is truer than the world of the senses, a world that is always in excess of the reality of matter and things, a transcendental world. And accordingly, quote, understanding, noesis, dealing with the highest, thought, dianoia, dealing with the second, opinion and imagination, dealing with the physical world. Well, boy, that was difficult. And really, we could go on and on about every different dimension of it for hours. Is it really any wonder, therefore, that most students of philosophy skip the divided line or skim over it, especially in lower and upper division classes, and look only to the myth of the cave? What a great educator must Plato be if he's able to distill some sense of the divided line within the myth of the cave, arrange them in proportion, and consider that each shares in clarity to the degree that the subsection it deals with shares in truth. In other words, there is a type of truth proper to each stage of the divided line, proper organization of the whole of knowledge, as well as of Kallipolis under the guidance of philosopher kings. Don't feel bad if a lot of that went over our heads. Even Glycon doesn't quite get it. I think I understand, he says, but not adequately. You see, in my opinion, you are speaking of a truly enormous task. You want to distinguish the part of what is and is intelligible, the part looked at by the science of dialectical discussion, as clearer than that part looked at by the so-called sciences, techni, those for which hypotheses are first principles. And although those who look at the latter part are compelled to do so by means of thought rather than sense perception, still, because they do not go back to the genuine first principle in considering it, but proceed from hypotheses, you do not think that they have true understanding of them, even though, given first principles, they ought to be intelligible. It seemed to me to call the state of mind of the geometers and others of that sort thought, but not understanding, thought being intermediate between belief and understanding. This is actually a pretty good synopsis on Glycon's part, and if you get it, you get all that Plato really expected to be digested at this point in the dialectical discussion and unfolding of his argument. As we'll see, these matters are very difficult and require extensive reflection that could go on for years. Knowing of reality is, in the Republic, an experience of truth, arrived at through dialectical reason, and it is always more truth than we can handle. In the Theaetetus, Plato will even increase the difficulty of this account of knowledge and reality given in the Republic, turning the experience of truth into a limitroffic situation, a treadmill in which the philosopher never really even attains truth, but is always working hard on the treadmill of justification, coming as close to the truth as possible. Okay, we've arrived at a short intermission and the beginning of our study of Plato's Myth of the Cave. All these YouTube versions of the Myth of the Cave are really excellent, each in their own way. The classic remains Orson Welles' narration of the Myth of the Cave, which we'll show now in this video. Enjoy it and see you after the intermission. When we return, we'll just discuss Heidegger's overall interpretation of the Myth of the Cave.
Let me show in a parable to what extent our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Envision human figures living in an underground cave with a long entrance across the whole width of the cave. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning their heads around. Above and behind them, a fire is blazing at a distance. They see only their own shadows, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. For how could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? Between the fire and the prisoners, there is a raised way and a low wall built along the way like the screen which puppet players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. Do you see men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of articles which they hold projected above the wall, statues of men and animals made of wood and stone and various materials. Of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they would only see the shadows. And if they were able to converse with one another, would they not suppose that they were naming what was actually before them? And suppose further that there was an echo which came from the wall. Would they not be sure to think when one of the passers-by spoke that the voice came from the passing shadows? To them, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images. And now look again and see what will naturally follow if one of the prisoners is released. At first, when he is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his head round and look towards the light, all this would hurt him, and he would be much too dazzled to see distinctly those things whose shadows he had seen before. And then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion, but that now, when he's approaching nearer to reality and his eyes turn toward more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not think that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent and held fast until he is forced into the presence of the sun himself. When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. He will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. And first he will see the shadows best. Next, the reflections of objects in the water, and then the objects themselves. Then he will gaze upon the stars and the spangled heavens, and the light of the moon. He will see the sky and the stars by night. Last of all, he will be able to see the sun, and not mere reflections of it in the water, but he will see the sun in its own proper place, and not in another. And he will contemplate the sun as it is. Will he not then proceed to argue that it is the sun who gives the season and the years, and is the guardian of all that is in the visible world, and in a certain way the cause of all things which his fellows have been accustomed to behold? Clearly he would first see the sun, and then reason about it. And when he remembered his old habitation and what was the wisdom of the cave and his fellow prisoners, do you not suppose that he would bless himself for the change and pity them? And if they were in the habit of conferring honors among themselves on those who were the quickest to observe the passing shadows, and to remark which of them went before and which followed after, and which were together, and who were therefore best able to draw conclusions as to the future, do you think that he would care for such honors and glories, or envy the possessors of them? Would he not say with Homer, "Better to be the poor servant of a poor master, and to endure anything rather than think as they do and live after their manner"? Imagine once more such a one coming suddenly out of the sun, to be replaced in his old situation? Would he not be certain to have his eyes full of darkness? And if there were a contest of measuring the shadows, and he had to compete with the prisoners who had never moved out of the den, while his sight was still weak, and before his eyes had become steady, wouldn't they all laugh at him and say he had spoiled his eyesight by going up there, and that it was better not to even think of ascending? And if anyone tried to release another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. It is the task of the enlightened not only to ascend to learning and to see the good, but to be willing to descend again to those prisoners and to share their troubles and their honors, whether they are worth having or not. And this they must do, even with the prospect of death. They shall give of their help to one another, wherever each class is able to help the community.
One of the most significant interpretations of Plato's Myth of the Cave and its philosophy of education is found in Martin Heidegger's essay, Plato's Doctrine of Truth, which you can find in path marks here, and has been included in the course modules for this week. This essay was first published in 1931 and translated for us by Thomas Sheehan. Its most basic point for interpreting the myth of the cave might actually be summarized in this little diagram. Heidegger wants us to think more about how truth differs depending on the stage and layer of the cave. In stage 1, the cave dweller is still bound in the shackles and perceives only the dimmest form of truth, that is the truth of what is presented as the shadows on the cave wall. When the cave dweller is liberated from their shackles, they notice that this reality is a production of a deeper truth, which is at first painful and bewildering, the truth of the fire and the puppeteers, or the cave reality producers. And the meaning of truth changes yet again when the cave dweller leaves the cave, becoming the truth of the world of true reality, or the forms. The fourth stage is when the cave dweller returns back into the cave in order to teach of the truth which they saw in the outside world. I'm just going to give the most schematic of outlines of Heidegger's seminal essay, which begins by pointing out that Plato's myth of the cave is an allegory from the Greek word allegoresis, meaning to show something by means of something else. In this case, what is doing the showing is the cave story, and what it is showing is the 4 stages of the divided line. It's a testimony to Plato's greatness as an educator that his myth of education, the allegory of the cave, is endlessly provocative, profound, and productive, simply read on its own, outside of the context of the Republic. In a survey course on ancient philosophy, however, unlike, say, in an introductory class to philosophy, the onus is on us to really situate and notice how exactly the myth of the cave is an allegory of the divided line. In accordance with the divided line, Heidegger divides the myth of the cave up into 4 different dwelling places in specific gradations of up and down. In stage 1, people live inside the cave, engrossed in what they immediately encounter. In no way would those who are chained like this ever consider anything else to be the unhidden or the true, except the shadows cast by the artifacts. Stage 1 corresponds to the lowest level of the divided line, the imagination or ikasia, seeing only images and not the things themselves. Stage 2 is moving around inside the cave, and it begins when those imprisoned in the cave are now free in a certain sense. They can turn around, creak their heads, and see the puppet theater which creates the reality they know, and even examine the props and the artifacts, and eventually look at the fire inside the cave. This is akin to when modern humans realize what they believe to be true has in fact been manufactured for them by the creators of culture. In the contemporary sense, Hollywood, Instagram influencers, and the demagoguery of contemporary politics all qualify as puppet theater in Plato's sense. In stage 2, the social production of reality seems like reality itself, at least until the arche or principle of creation of this reality is revealed through examining the fire. In stage 2, those who before looked only at shadows now come a little nearer to what is. And this corresponds to the next level of the divided line, opinion, pistis, or belief, doxa. And it would probably be fair to say that 95% or more of the internet reflects a consciousness that is at stage 2, relying only on opinion and belief. According to Heidegger, in stage 1, what is true or alethes, unhidden, is just the shadows cast by the artifacts. And Heidegger helpfully finds the word alethes repeated frequently in Plato's own myth in the Greek. The word alethes is first used to describe stage 1 in regards to the shadows and artifacts, but it occurs again at the end of the description of stage 2. And even more significant, it now occurs in a comparative degree, alethestera, the more true or the more unhidden. The experience of truth in Plato and Heidegger involves graduated degrees. And what is peculiar in stage 1 and 2 is that the more proper truth is still found in the shadows or the production of shadows. The recently unshackled prisoners do not yet know what they are seeing in the cave. The images on the cave wall are adjusted to this type of insight. And in entering into the full range of stage 2, dawning fact emerges that what we've been living is a lie. In the first instance, this dawning realization is painful and bewildering. The situation of the puppet theater and the fire is uncanny. Who are the puppeteers? What are the artifacts that are being shown? This situation cannot be fully understood except on the basis of a journey through and outside the cave. And in this sense, Plato's myth of the cave is not incorrectly read as a myth of enlightenment comparable to Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Note, it would be fully conceivable for many of the unshackled cave dwellers in stage 2 to simply remain by the true fire in the cave and to become reality producers or puppeteers themselves. The detail in Plato's myth is not so great as to identify the cave dwellers or human beings with the puppeteers. Plato thinks them more as daimones or spiritual agencies, responsible for mediating, for better or for worse, the reality experienced by human beings. There is thus an ontological distinction in Plato's recounting of the myth between the puppeteers as spiritual beings and humans. It's nevertheless conceivable that the humans who are released into stage 2 and overcome the painful and bewildering effects of the fire, and the puppeteers join in some sense in the ranks of reality producers, still far away from any desire or will to leave the cave. Just as Plato's philosopher kings must be forced to return to the cave to become rulers, so those in the initial stages of liberation must be forced to overcome even the fascination with reality production and to go outside. This begins stage 3, or the ascent to the most true, and real freedom is attained only in this stage, according to Heidegger. Here, someone who has been unshackled is at the same time conveyed outside the cave and into the open, and there, above ground, all things are manifest. Things stand there in the binding force and validity of their own visible form. And right at the beginning of stage 3, Plato speaks again in the language of truth of what is now addressed as the unhidden, alethon. The lowest form of truth in stage 1, simply what is revealed, having passed through the more unhidden, reality production, and now in stage 3, beginning the ascent into truth itself. Heidegger comments, the fulfillment of education can be achieved only in the region of and on the basis of the most unhidden, the alethestaton, i.e. the truest truth. The essence of education is grounded in the essence of truth. This stage corresponds to the third quarter of the divided line, learning to think, dianoia, the things of the world, or X-types, on the basis of the forms as paradigms, but not yet intellectually understanding, noesis, the forms themselves as prototypes. It could be said that the dragging outside of the cave and the initial stages of life outside the cave gives way by the end of stage 3 to an understanding of the forms themselves. But for Heidegger, this begs the question, how are the forms given or accessed in thinking outside the cave? And here Plato articulates two main ways in which forms are present in the soul in both the above and the below phase of the divided line. When you are outside the cave, forms are manifested through participation or methexis. When you're inside the cave, forms are manifest through imitation or mimesis. The task of education is to gain insight as to how the things themselves are participant in the forms themselves. Any failure to do this puts us back inside the cave, below stage 3. There is an enormous amount more to explore in Heidegger's essay, but to be schematic and brief and end this long video, in stage 4, or the return to the cave, Heidegger configures the cave as the site of a battle waged between the liberators and the prisoners who resist liberation, while Plato situates the realm outside the cave in terms of stages 3 and 4 of the divided line. Significantly, Heidegger identifies the highest part of stage 4 as a return to the cave, but paradoxically as a return wherein being itself and the good beyond being come to be at stake within the cave itself. Originally, for the Greeks, hiddenness as an act of self-hiding permeated the essence of being. Truth originally means what was wrested from hiddenness. It is insufficient for Heidegger to simply imagine the philosopher outside the cave, gaining access to the forms themselves and the good beyond being, and remaining there in pure unhiddenness. Here, Plato's own myth comes up against its limits, which Plato acknowledges by forcing the knower of the forms and the good to re-enter the cave. It is only by understanding the forms and truths in the realm of hiddenness itself, that is the cave, that they come into their deepest unveiling. Truth is always a battle or wresting of unhiddenness from hiddenness. The upshot and takeaway from Heidegger's overall interpretation might be summed up in a thought experiment. Imagine waking up into a world cave permeated by being, truth, and nature as hiding and withdrawn. Heidegger thus uses Plato's myth of the cave as an opportunity to give a little lesson in etymology. The Greek word for truth, aletheia, the a is alpha privative, literally meaning unforgetting or unconcealing. It is far from clear that the Greeks always used the word with this intention, and yet there are some good examples where they do. According to Heidegger, in his overall interpretation of the myth of the cave, what it presents to us is Plato's doctrine of truth. And what this doctrine is grounded in is the unspoken event whereby the idea gains dominance over the revealing, the form gaining dominance over aletheia, indeed as substituting for aletheia. Plato, the process of truth or unveiling is subsumed within the idea as what first lets something else behind it shine in its own appearance, the idea itself becoming what shines. And Heidegger thus asks, what makes the things seen in the act of seeing, i.e. the known and the knower, be what they are in their relation? What spans the space between knowing and knower is the yoke or zugon that holds together the sensible and the supersensible world. According to Heidegger, because of ideas in Plato, everything now depends on the orthotes or correctness of the gaze. What results from this is the conforming of apprehension as an idea to the idea as homeosis, an analogy or likeness, and thus an agreement of the act of knowing with the thing itself. We are truly reading in Plato's myth of the cave is the coming to priority and dominance of the idea over aletheia, that is, a transformation of the essence of truth. After Plato and on the basis of Plato's divided line and myth of the cave, truth ceases to be a process of revealing and concealing, but rather becomes orthotes, a matter of correctness. Transformation is not yet complete in Plato, but it's on the basis of Plato that it begins. Okay, so we did it. Books 1 to 7 of the Republic. I look forward to seeing you next week when we pick up Plato's Republic, the rest of books 7 to 10. Have a good week.